Imagine you are the most sought-after pianist in Vienna. You have built everything, your reputation, your livelihood, your entire sense of self, on your ears. Music is not just what you do, it is how you think. It is the language in which you understand the world. Now imagine a ringing starts, high-pitched, constant, inescapable, and slowly beneath it, everything else begins to fade. The voices of friends, the strings of an orchestra, the notes of your own piano. Until one day there is nothing left but silence and that relentless ringing. This is what happened to Ludwig van Beethoven. And yet, after all of that, he wrote the Ninth Symphony, the greatest choral symphony ever composed. He wrote it completely deaf. How? How does a man compose the greatest choral symphony ever written without hearing a single note of it? That is the question we're here to answer. To understand what Beethoven lost, you have to understand what he had. By his late 20s, Beethoven was already the most celebrated composer and pianist in Vienna. He had arrived from Bonn in 1792, studied briefly under Haydn, and within years had eclipsed nearly every musician in Europe. He was brash, magnetic, and electrifyingly original. The nobility competed to host him. Publishers competed to print him. He was, by any measure, at the beginning of an extraordinary career. Then, around 1798, when he was 27 years old, something changed. He began to notice a ringing in his ears, what we now call tinnitus. High-pitched sounds became harder to detect. Conversations in noisy rooms became impossible to follow. He would ask people to repeat themselves, then again, then again. He began to withdraw from social gatherings, not out of arrogance, but out of the terror of being found out. For a man whose entire identity was built on his ears, this was not just frightening, it was existential. He saw doctors, he tried every treatment available, almond oil poured into his ears, cold baths, special hearing trumpets. None of it worked. By 1801, he had lost roughly 60% of his hearing, and he had told almost no one. In June 1801, Beethoven finally broke his silence, but only in a letter to his closest friend, the physician Franz Wegeler. He wrote, "I lead a wretched life. For almost 2 years I have ceased to attend any social functions, just because I find it impossible to say to people, 'I am deaf.'" He kept the secret fiercely. When strangers approached him in the street, he couldn't hear them, and rather than reveal his condition, he would simply stare, leaving them to think him cold or strange or rude. The composer the world saw as fierce and antisocial was, in truth, a man in quiet, constant panic. In the spring of 1802, his doctor, Johann Adam Schmidt, urged him to leave Vienna. He sent Beethoven to Heiligenstadt, a small village outside the city, tucked among rolling hills and vineyards, hoping that rest and quiet would ease the inflammation in his ears. It didn't. That autumn, on the 6th of October, 1802, Beethoven sat down and wrote a letter to his brothers, Karl and Johann. He was 31 years old. The letter was never sent. It was found, sealed among his private papers, only after his death, 25 years later. We now call it the Heiligenstadt Testament. It is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of music, part confession, part last will, part cry of despair. Beethoven wrote that he had contemplated suicide, that he was ashamed of his condition, that he felt cut off from humanity, from the art form he had built his life upon. But then, buried inside the anguish, came something else, a defiant turn. He wrote, "It seemed impossible to leave the world until I had brought forth all that I felt was within me." He sealed the letter, he put it away, and he went back to work. What happened next is one of the most remarkable transformations in artistic history. After Heiligenstadt, Beethoven didn't retreat, he exploded. The period from roughly 1803 to 1814, what music historians call his heroic or middle period, produced some of the most powerful music ever written. the Third Symphony, the Eroica, the Fifth Symphony with its famous four-note Fate motif, the Appassionata Sonata, the Razumovsky String Quartets, the opera Fidelio. These are not the works of a man defeated by suffering, they are the works of a man energized by it. Scholars have long noted that as Beethoven's hearing declined, his music became louder, bolder, more rhythmically driven, and structurally daring. In part, this may have been practical. He began writing for his inner ear, the music in his mind, rather than the sounds he could physically hear. And the music of the mind, unconstrained by what was physically possible or socially acceptable, could go further. There is also a profound emotional logic. A man who has known silence understands the weight of sound. Beethoven had felt music at the limits of human experience, and that is exactly what his music began to sound like. By around 1814, at age 44, he was nearly completely deaf. He could no longer perform in public. He could no longer conduct reliably. He began carrying small notebooks, what we call conversation books, so that visitors could write down what they wanted to say to him. He spoke, the world wrote back. By 1818, Beethoven was entirely deaf, and here is where the story becomes almost impossible to believe. In the final decade of his life, composing in total silence, Beethoven wrote what many consider the greatest music ever created. His late period, the final 5-string quartets, the Missa Solemnis, the Diabelli Variations, and the Ninth Symphony. These works baffled his contemporaries. It wasn't the first time. Years earlier, when the violinist Felix Radicati told Beethoven that the Razumovsky quartets were incomprehensible, Beethoven replied without hesitation, "They are not for you, they are for a later age." The late quartets were stranger still. Critics called them bizarre, incomprehensible, even amateurish. They couldn't understand them because they had never heard anything like them. We now understand that Beethoven, freed from what was physically possible to hear, was writing music that existed entirely in the mind. He used the piano to feel vibrations, pressing his ear against the soundboard, or sometimes biting down on a wooden stick attached to the piano so he could sense the resonance in his jaw. He navigated sound through touch, memory, and an extraordinary lifelong internalization of musical structure. He could not hear a single note he was writing, and yet he was hearing everything. Musicians and scholars call this ability inner hearing, the capacity to imagine music in the mind with complete clarity. Most composers have some of it. Beethoven's, by this point in his life, had become absolute. In May 1824, the Ninth Symphony premiered at the Kärntner Tortheater in Vienna. Beethoven was on stage, not to conduct, but to stand beside the conductor and follow the score so the orchestra could see him. He was at this point profoundly and completely deaf. The performance was a triumph. The audience rose to their feet and applauded 5 times, an extraordinary outpouring in an era when such demonstrations were strictly regulated in court theatres. Beethoven didn't hear any of it. A soloist, accounts differ on who stepped forward and gently turned him around to face the audience. He saw thousands of people on their feet, hats thrown into the air, handkerchiefs waving, people weeping. He had composed one of the greatest works in human history without hearing a single bar of it played. The Ninth Symphony is not just musically revolutionary, it was the first major symphony to include a full chorus and vocal soloists. Its final movement, setting Friedrich Schiller's poem Ode to Joy, declared something radical, that joy itself was worth striving for, that suffering was not the end of the story. Beethoven knew something about that. So let's return to our original question. How did he do it? The honest answer is through a combination of extraordinary memory, decades of musical training, and a level of musical imagination that borders on the miraculous. Beethoven had spent 30 years internalizing the physics and grammar of music before deafness fully took hold. He knew, at an almost cellular level, how a particular combination of notes would sound, how a harmonic shift would feel, how the weight of a bass line would change the mood of a phrase. He didn't need to hear these things anymore, he could see them on the page. He also adapted. His late music leans heavily on lower registers and resonant bass, partly because those were the frequencies he could still faintly sense through vibration. His use of rhythm became more complex, possibly because rhythm, more than pitch, can be felt physically. And he never stopped. Sketches, revisions, notebooks filled with crossed-out lines and desperate scrawl and sudden breakthroughs. Beethoven worked the way a sculptor works, by feel, by instinct, by sheer ferocious will. Beethoven died in March 1827 at the age of 56. Among his papers, his friends found the Heiligenstadt Testament, the letter he had written 25 years earlier, sealed, unsent, and never shown to anyone. They read it, and they understood, finally, what they had known alongside without knowing, that the greatest composer who ever lived had fought, every day, in complete secrecy, against the thing most likely to destroy him. He lost his hearing. He never lost his music. And in that strange, terrible, beautiful fact lies something that goes beyond music. A reminder that what we carry inside us cannot always be taken away by what happens to us on the outside. The Ninth Symphony exists. The late string quartets exist. The Ode to Joy exists. All of it composed in silence. All of it heard by everyone but him. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed this video, you can help these stories travel by leaving a comment, liking the video, sharing it with someone who might enjoy it, or subscribing to the channel. It really does make a difference. That's it from me today. I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you again in the next episode.